underlying critical functions of racist nativism is that there is a perceived threat, right? And that's when we begin to see these surges, is that when there's a perceived threat of a population of color, right? That's when we begin to see these upticks in instances of violence, with Asian Americans being targeted right now in this moment, right? Because of the kind of ongoing pandemic, we see that happening. There's a perceived threat of just existence, right? Just being in a space. And that's something that we've seen historically over and over again, which is, so what we're trying to do is figure out, how do we begin to disrupt some of these cycles in our schools for our students, right, who are experiencing this every day.
Mm-hmm. Hello, and welcome to Student Affairs Now. I'm your host, Keith Edwards. Today, we're discussing the racist rhetoric from politicians and other figures in U.S. culture and the implications for harm, activism, and social change, with the two editors and also authors of the new book, Why They Hate Us: How Racist Rhetoric Impacts Education. Very timely indeed. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We hope you'll find these conversations make a contribution to the field and are restorative to the profession. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays. Find us at studentaffairsnow.com or on Twitter. Today's episode is sponsored by Stylus and Leadership. Stylus is proud to be a sponsor of Student Affairs Now podcast. Browse their student affairs, diversity, and professional development titles at styluspub.com. You can use promo code SANOW for 30% off all their books, plus free shipping. You can find Stylus on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter at StylusPub. Leadership is a not-for-profit organization that has been partnering with colleges, universities, and organizations in creating transformational leadership experiences since 1986. With a focus on creating a more just, caring, and thriving world, Leadership provides both virtual and in-person leadership development opportunities for students and professionals. When you partner with Leadership, you'll receive quality development experiences that engage learners in topics of courageous dialogue, integrity, equity, resilience, and community building. To find out more about their virtual programs, please visit leadership.org/virtual programs. You can also learn more about their organization on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. As I mentioned, I'm your host, Keith Edwards. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a speaker, consultant, and coach, and you can find out more about me at keithedwards.com. I'm hosting this conversation today from Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is the ancestral homeland of both the Dakota and the Ojibwe peoples. Today, we're exploring the racist rhetoric in our culture, its impact and solutions to move us forward. Let's meet our two guests for today. Today, we get a real treat. We get usual host Susana Muñoz is here as a guest, and your co-editor and scholar and friend. So let's get a chance to meet both of you. Lindsay, let's begin with you. Tell us a little bit about you and how you came to this particular project, and then we'll hear from Susana.
Sure. My name is Lindsey PerezHuber. I'm an associate professor in the College of Education at Cal State Long Beach. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And so this work connects, I think, most closely to my work around race and education and immigration, looking at how anti-Latinx racism emerges in educational trajectories of Latinx students, and also kind of trying to understand the forms of systemic racism that students are experiencing in school systems. It also connects, I think, in some ways to my work around racial microaggressions as well. So kind of the everyday forms of racism and racist nativism that students of color encounter.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Lindsay. Really appreciate that. And the microaggressions, I think we're getting you on a podcast episode coming up here soon. So we're giving our audience a double dose of you, which is wonderful to do. Susana, tell folks who don't know you, who haven't listened to your other episodes as a host, tell us a little bit about you as a guest and your work with this book.
Sure. So again, Susana Muñoz, she, her, hers, they pronouns. I'm coming to you from the land of the ancestral homelands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne peoples. And I am an associate professor and program chair of the Higher Education Leadership Program at Colorado State University. And the way I arrived to this work is very similar to Lindsay, in the sense that, working with and for undocumented students and immigrant communities in my research, and really tackling notions of anti-immigration sentiments. I think I fangirl Lindsay all the time, because I cite her stuff and her framing. It's super useful to frame what's happening with undocumented college students from like a racist nativist lens. And so I think what the way I come into the work and is also thinking about how the elections have impacted our college students, and just really thinking intently about our administrators as well, and what needs to change, and how do we handle sort of this really, really fine line around free speech versus hate speech that comes in many forms on our college campuses. So I'm happy to be here and excited for the conversation.
Wonderful. Well, let's hear a little bit about this book, this project that you've been working on probably for years now, and is now out and available for folks. Lindsay, why don't you tell us a little bit about the book, how it came to be, and a quick outline for context?
Sure. So I think the book, if I think back kind of where it started, I was thinking about this the other day about Susana. It was at a conference we were at UC Riverside, when we were asked to come in and talk about experiences of undocumented students there. And Susana and I were having a side conversation, and she was telling me, did you hear what happened at Iowa State? And I said, no, what happened? And so she's telling me about during the time Trump is just beginning, his campaigning, and there was a rally there of students, and students are talking about and yelling, relating white supremacy to Trump, right? And there was one young girl who said something like, vote for white supremacy, to show her support, for this candidate. And it was this moment where I was like, whoa, what's going on, right? Like really wanting to understand what was happening, because racism has always been there, but it was emerging in kind of a particular way that we hadn't really seen in kind of recent decades. And so really wanting to understand how the political context was now kind of changing the discourse around racism to these more kind of overt, right, support of racism and white supremacy. And so I think it was kind of like in conversation with Susana, and this was, I guess it was in 2015 when the campaign had just started. And then really paying attention and kind of documenting, what was happening from there is trying to understand how this campaign really had kind of a significant impact on the discourses around racism that were targeting Latinx immigrants in particular, right? And wanting to kind of theorize that and document it, and help us understand what was happening at that moment. And so that's, I think, kind of where the very early ideas of the book came from. And then I guess the actual work on the book started, maybe it was about a year and a half ago, Susana.
Mm-hmm.
As the election year was coming, really wanting to have a book that would document the experiences of how this racist rhetoric was impacting students in our schools, and particularly students of color, especially immigrant students. And so that's when Susana and I started, talking about, working together on a book that would invite people who were doing that research to have chapters that would really lay out, how this mattered for students in their everyday lives and in their schooling experiences, both in K-12 and also in higher ed.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Yeah.
I love this story about, a partnership and a particular place and hearing a particular thing. And then from that moment in a campaign in 2015, the rhetoric to me seems like it has just been escalating and escalating. And maybe the feelings and ideas underneath it have always been there, but the boldness and the explicitness and the willing to be public about some of this really seems to have escalated. Susana, what would you want to add? And we'd love a little quick outline of the book for context.
Yeah, so I think what Lindsay was saying is that we were all watching what was happening on our college campuses, and with that event at Iowa State, I think was like, a profound, and it was videotaped, right? And so it was like you got to see it on YouTube, what this woman said, and she just sort of ripped down a sign that somebody was holding in protest of Trump. And so I think we continue to see that embolden this. And one of the visuals that I often use in presentations is that at Colorado State, all our Lori Student Center, students build a cardboard wall, saying this is Trump's wall, and I think that to me was like, this is pretty emboldened and blatant what we're seeing. And not only that, we were also seeing a lot of white nationalist paraphernalia being posted on our campuses, around white nationalist identities, and when we both were looking at what we call the Trump effect, what the Southern Poverty Law Center called the Trump effect, is sort of this heightened emboldenedness, in our schools. And so, what we outline in this book is, sort of like the educational pipeline of how this rhetoric has impacted, school children, and how principals have been noticing and heightened hate messages in schooling, and understanding, how it's also mitigated. Our principals talking about this. And so what's really cool about this book is that it really touches like every aspect of the educational pipeline, from community college to K through 12, and then also showing how kids are really resisting, how using their art and voice to really resist. And I think what was really profound for me, and the beautiful contributions that the authors make, is that they utilize the moment to help children really understand their context and really what's at stake, and to really fight back, and to say that I care this much about my community. I want this to stop. And so I think that the book really does a great job of outlining that. And I think the conclusion chapter was, I think it was really hard for me and Lindsay to conclude this book, because stuff just kept happening, right? And so it was like, it's like, oh my gosh, like another Black man was murdered. We need to acknowledge this, and another incident and another incident, and I think we were closing or submitting the entire manuscript, and then January 6th happened with the insurrection at the Capitol, and we're just like, oh my God, I think both Lindsay and I were like, I wish I could have taken back our book and written more about that, because it connects to everything that we were writing about. So I feel this really captures sort of what we're not only historically where we have been rooted, but currently where we're at.
Great. Well, so glad that you moved a conversation to this project. So timely, so prescient of you to see this coming and wanting to document the impact on students. And I love how you have organized the authors in really lots of different perspectives: the art, the history, theoretical and conceptual framing, praxis, really looking at a lot of different things from a lot of different angles. And there's really a tone here of, here's the problem, here's how it affects people, here's how people are resisting, and there's some possibilities here. So Lindsay, tell us a little bit about how you framed the book and your thinking as you were organizing it and reaching out to authors and organizing chapters.
Yeah, so I think the way that Susana and I really were intentional about the framing was to use critical race theory as kind of a foundational point to theorize the racist rhetoric that we saw happening. And so from CRT, we use the conceptual framework of racist nativism that really looks at the intersections of race and immigration status and how it matters in the lives of immigrant students. And so, and also what Susana mentioned earlier is, trying to figure out what was happening with this kind of emboldened behavior, right? That was both, a more comfortable performance of white supremacy in terms of, right, the building of the cardboard walls and and posting of white supremacist propaganda, but also the real violence that was being perpetrated upon communities of color, right, by white nationalists and neo-Nazis and what was happening during the time. Charlottesville is also something that we talk about in the book. Right. That, all of a sudden we see this kind of surge in white nationalism. And so the introduction really tries to kind of set the foundation of, how do we use CRT to theorize what we see happening and racist nativism? So looking at also how cultural theory can help us understand how, what's happening is that these discourses of racism and white supremacy begin to influence behaviors of people, right, through articulatory practices. So this is like some of Stuart Hall's work that, right, so we have these beliefs and ideologies in racism and white supremacy operating. We see those clearly, but those are really what is directly influencing the behaviors of people to enact, right, building of cardboard walls or to perpetrate like actual violence or to come out and, march around Robert E. Lee on their college campuses. And so that's kind of how the introduction is framed, and also really acknowledging, and Susana does this also in the following chapters, we've also been very intentional to talk about, as you mentioned earlier, history, right? And how, yes, we can look at the Trump era, but this didn't start with Trump, and as we see now, it certainly didn't end with Trump. Right. And so this racism and these articulatory practices of racist nativism have a historical legacy that goes back many years in the U.S. And then in the first chapter, Susana kind of extends on some of those frames that are introduced in the beginning, and then expands on them to talk about imperialistic reclamation.
Before we move there, could you just give us a little bit more about racist nativism? Just tell us a little bit more about what that is and what that means.
Yeah, so racist nativism is a concept that was theorized from CRT that was really meant to understand that intersection between race and immigration status. And so how are Latinx students in particular racialized as immigrant, whether they are immigrant or maybe born here, right? And so so racist nativism is also placed within or situated within kind of a historical context to understand how various immigrant groups of color throughout the US have been targeted by racist nativism, right? So this idea that you are a perpetual foreigner. But at the same time, what's important about racist nativism is that there is this kind of racialized foreignness, but that has a function. So there is a function to the racialization of foreignness for people of color, and that is to uphold the status of who is perceived to be native, which historically in the US has perceived to be white folks, right? Yeah. And so there's kind of a dual kind of function of racist nativism that upholds the status of the perceived native. And this is problematic, right? Because we know that right, indigenous communities have been here and preceded white settlers for thousands of years. But also there's this process of racialized foreignness that people of color have been targeted by historically.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's very helpful. I really appreciate that. Susana, what were you going to add here about the framing?
No, I think one of the other framings that we used here too is to talk about sort of the intersection of interest convergence and whiteness as property. And so interest convergence was coined by Derek Bell, and it just insinuates that where that benefits to people of color are only delivered when it also benefits white people, right? And so as long as that there's that interest for whiteness. I think that's where it's a lot more palatable. So when we talk about, whiteness as property, we talk about sort of this notion of how to sustain white supremacy and how that's systemic, but also we see in our society sort of this notion of imperialistic reclamation, which is sort of the reclaiming of those, those perceived benefits to people of color. And so one of the, prime examples is that we often use as affirmative action, right? And so, only when it benefits, and it has benefited white people, do we allow that. But when we see, more minoritized bodies, sort of in those spaces of whiteness, and that's sort of where that reclamation comes in. And so we see that, being articulated, through racist nativism. And so it's not, it's not a surprise that, there is this, anti-immigrant, rhetoric out there, because, our leader, a former leader, was, using racist rhetoric to frame this population. And so what happens is that there's this emboldenedness to sort of take back what was sort of perceived as, whiteness, right? Take back sort of things that were originally deemed, for certain people. And so we see that in terms of the demographic, changes that, and again, we have to really, I go back to Lindsay's chapter where she talks about, like in 1990, what was the Proposition 180, or So, say that again, Lindsay?
Prop 187 in 1994.
Right. And so, that was all framed around save our state from immigrants, right? And so, and that passed. So I think what we continue to see these patterns articulated, not only, from a historical sense, but contemporary. We see these patterns of, there demographically, there's too many, right, minoritized bodies. Demographically, there's too many immigrants. And so there continues to be sort of this emboldened backlash. And so that's how the interest convergence and whiteness as property, when they intersect with one another, we get this imperialistic reclamation where it's that, okay, we need to take this back. And so that's what we're seeing.
There's some real heavy lifting terms: racist nativism,
I know,
interest convergence, whiteness as property, imperialistic reclamation. Love learning about all of this, and both of you are so clear about how this connects. But what it's, as I'm listening to this, it's reminding me that we are now seeing that people who stormed the Capitol predominantly came from the number one predictor was they came from counties where the white population was going down. And so it's a very tangible thing, as you're pointing to these dynamics, these sociocultural factors, and then the rhetoric leading to action and violence, right? Where it's there. So,
and I think that's one. Oh, sorry. No,
go ahead.
I think that's one of kind of the underlying critical functions of racist nativism, is that there is a perceived threat. Right. And that's when we begin to see these surges, is that when there's a perceived threat of a population of color, right, that's when we begin to see these upticks in instances of violence, with Asian Americans being targeted right now in this moment, right, because of the kind of ongoing pandemic. We see that happening. There's a perceived threat of just existence, right, just being in a space. And that's something that we've seen historically over and over again, which is, so what we're trying to do is figure out, how do we begin to disrupt some of these cycles in our schools for our students, right, who are experiencing this every day.
And the one thing that I would just, I just wanted to add sort of, what you said, Keith, in terms of like, this fear of being replaced. That's exactly what it is, right? And so there's actually like historical documents and even anti-immigrant propaganda that was produced back in, the early 1900s around replacement theory, right? And so you connect that to the chants from Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, you will not replace us. That's exactly what's happening in terms of what empiric reclamation looks like.
Well, and you have these trends, these demographics, then you have all of this rhetoric, and some of the people using the rhetoric are violent. Some of them are using the rhetoric or giving permission. They may not be violent themselves, but that rhetoric gives permission to others, which we see. Anybody who's been on a playground knows that if you, some people will talk the talk, but not do it, but they give permission for others to take that action, right? Whether that's bullying or storming the Capitol or posting boxes, a lot of justification. I'd love to move to the impacts and also some of the solutions. So Susana, maybe you can begin by telling us about what, through this project and others, what you're seeing as the impacts of this rhetoric on all of us.
So I think the number one impact that I sort of saw across all of the chapters was on mental wellness, right? On mental health, in terms of what this rhetoric does to children, on a deep level in terms of being learners, and existing in spaces where that's a perpetual thing that they have to see on an ongoing basis, not only within their school, but in communities. And so I think, what I liked about what the authors had to offer is, there has to be a point where we go beyond sort of like, the dialogue, right? The dialogue is great. Having more conversations, around sort of these decolonizing curriculums, and really naming like white supremacy, really being authentic about how our country has framed immigrants from the beginning. And so I think having those conversations is important, and action. And so it's not enough to just leave it at the yes, we're going to train our way out of this, we're going to talk through, and do book clubs, and there has to be something entrenched within our schooling system, some notion of accountability pieces that really centers humanity, that really centers what does it mean to be anti-racist, as a school, as a pedagogy, as a leader. So I think those are the impact and the I think my wishes, is that this book just goes beyond, the conversation, that you really take a look at the book and see, okay, what are some systemic changes that we can be thinking about in how to create anti-racist schooling within our system.
Yeah, as you're talking about the dialogue and the value of dialogue, but that I was reminded of whose learning comes at whose expense, right? If we're going to have a lot of dialogue about whether certain people have equal humanity to others, so that some people can discover that and learn that, who has to continue justifying their existence and their humanity in the process of doing that, and what's the price that paid? And I think that is a very difficult thing and oftentimes ignored as we focus on the learning of the dominant culture, the dominant narrative. But then also, as you're talking about the learning and doing this, but moving to action, reminded of Paulo Freire's praxis. Let's keep learning and then doing, and then learning about how we did and do it better, and continue in that ongoing cycle. Lindsay, what would you want to add here about impacts and potential solutions?
Yeah, I think, just building off of what Susana is mentioning about, I think one thing that cuts across all of the chapters also is the need for campus leadership, whether that's leadership in K-12 schools or leadership in higher ed. to really want to do something, right? To really be able to understand the history of racism in the US, which most of our leadership does not, right? We get that in, very siloed disciplinary trainings and ethnic studies, which most folks, don't have the opportunity to take or don't take in their own educational trajectories. And understand how, right, what we see happening and what our students are experiencing every day are situated in much broader histories of, right, oppressive conditions and experiences. And, for leaders to not place the responsibility of this work on their faculty of color, on their teachers of color, on their students of color, and to really take the responsibility to learn and to do it on their own and learn how to do it. Right. That's one of the things that we talk about in the last chapter is how, both of us in our work as faculty, there's a cultural taxation that happens when you are, constantly the one being, tagged to do or to consult or to ask questions. It shouldn't be that way, right? It should be our campus leadership who begins to want to cultivate some of these skills and tools on their own to also be able to engage the work, which I think is really important, especially right now when so many schools and campuses and institutions are wanting to do anti-racist work. The labor is really playing out in very inequitable ways, and we see that happening all the time.
Right, and there's a tension there between wanting to center the voices of the minoritized and the oppressed, with also not wanting to place that burden on them, which reinforces those systems of oppression. And I'm just thinking a lot lately about how we don't try and either or that, but how do we go into the messiness of the both and of that and wrestle with that? Susana, what would you like to add here?
No, I think the other component of this is for institutions to really think about beyond performative activism, right? And so thinking about these very beautiful messages that get sent out when, events of injustices happens. But, I think it goes back to, okay, if you're really committed to being anti-racist and pro-equity, compensate the people that are doing the work, compensate those centers that do the bulk of this work, compensate ethnic studies, compensate, multicultural centers, compensates, students that are part of that educational process. And so I think, that commitment without any compensation is not a commitment. And so I think that's one of the things that I get very frustrated about is that there's really great PR around equity, with our institutions, but there's not necessarily the institutional action and how to make really courageous change within your institution to stop being a place that is upholds whiteness that we see on a constant level. So I'm always in tension with a higher education. I'm always in tension with, yes, being outspoken as an institution about these injustices, but you need to also look at, what's been going on in your own community to say, we need to do better, and we need to do better in these ways. And this is what we're committed to doing in terms of substantial, institutionalized, and holding people accountable. So yes, I'll get off my little soapbox.
I'm seeing we love your soapbox, Susana. We love it. I'm seeing a real mirror here between what the book is sort of chronicling, which is the rhetoric, and then the actions and violence that stems to that, to what you're calling for is not just rhetoric about anti-racism and supporting students and faculty, but also actions to compensate, to shift policy, to add requirements, to reorganize things, to do more than just do, as we've talked about in other contexts, performative land acknowledgements, to put out statements. I do think the statements have gotten better. They used to be really bad statements. The statements now are getting much better. So that's progress. Now, how do we go from good statements we went from bad statements to good statements. How do we go from good statements to good action? And hopefully there won't be sort of that bad action in between there. But there's a lot of space to go, as you pointed out, compensation, as we talked about ethnic studies availability and requirements and making part of the general education so that we have a broader understanding of these issues in the context that organizes and shapes every one of our lives, not just some of our lives. What would you like to add here, Lindsay, about the impacts and solutions? We have a lot of folks who are listening to this who are leaders in higher education, whether they're in positional leadership or they have the voice of the ears of students who look up to them and admire them as new professionals who they can see relate to them. Thoughts about ways that folks who are listening to this can move from the rhetoric to some solutions and some action.
Yeah, I think one thing to think about for administrators is that, more and more our demographics are shifting. Those in power, though, are not. And so what does that mean to be someone in a position of power who comes from a very different experience, a very different background than the institutions and schools and students inside those places look like or are from? And I think that, one thing that administrators need to start thinking about is, what does it mean to let go of a little bit of their power to lift up the students and the communities that they are committed to if we're talking about equity? What does that look like? Because there's some power dynamics that have to shift in order to do this work. And so what is it that needs to be let go? And when I say, letting go of power, that means not necessarily individually. Some of that can happen individually, but also in terms of the ways that we structure our institutions and our schools to operate, right? What needs to happen? What do we need to let go of in order to really think about how we can engage equity, how we can engage anti-racism? I think that's a really interesting kind of way to think about moving forward, as you said, kind of into this kind of process of a praxis, as Freire calls, right? Is that in that process that Freire talks about, when we're really able to engage in liberatory praxis, that's when there's some power let go and that the people, the oppressed, are lifted up, right? And so we have to start thinking about what that looks like within our institutions.
We're going to move towards concluding here in a moment in our last question. But before we get that, I have learned by editing books that where I began and where I ended up as the editor is very different. And I learned so much in the process of hearing the voices of the authors. And I know you've invited other authors in. You've both also written chapters. I'd love to hear from each of you. What's sort of like the big aha moment that you had through this process of a year and a half now plus of writing the book? What really was the thing that you learned through the process that is grabbing your attention?
There was a lot of aha moments. I mean, writing a book during the pandemic was like a huge, like that was a lot.
Well, not just a pandemic, but the racial unrest, COVID, everything. Virtual politics, insurrections. Yeah.
I mean, I think, I'm grateful that I got to do this along with Lindsay, because I think I was able to learn from her in this process in many ways. But I think, the aha moment for me was really about how it's not just Latinx communities. It's not just, it just spans across people of color in terms of, the racist, rhetoric with the Muslim ban. We see that with the virus has impacted, Asians and Asian Americans. And so I think, as we were editing and reading, I gained much more, I guess, an understanding of the importance of the theory and the importance of where we should be interrogating these issues that we're seeing, and how interrogating race and racism and white supremacy has to really be at the core of all of our conversations. And so I think for me, it was it was exciting to get to the point of reading, seeing the book in real life, but also, understanding that there's so much more work to do as well. So, but yeah, that was my.
Well, you're really, what I'm hearing that is the interconnections of struggle, the interconnections between Latinx folks and DACA and Asian Americans, all experiencing this racial nativism in very different ways, to indigenous peoples and indigenous issues. So much interconnectedness here. Lindsay, what were one or two of your aha moments as you went through this process?
I think just in terms of like logistics, this is my kind of first edited book. And so just to do this work like in community with Susana, in community with our chapter contributors, it was just, I think, an aha moment, which isn't necessarily an aha movement. Like I always knew that this was important, right? And doing this work in community really changes the experience. Right. And so more of just something I enjoyed about the process was working with Susana on this and, working and having conversations with our chapter contributors about, their writing and their understanding and their work was really, really important. And just made the work and the process so much better. The second thing I think is just thinking about what you're saying, Keith, about the hope, right, and possibility that is there, that this book kind of highlights about the intersecting experiences of various communities of color. And what we've seen since it was published, right, the most recent kind of anti-Asian hate that we see happening right now, that is also tied into exactly what we're trying to do in this book to understand. And that's to see how, right, the experiences of communities of color are so interconnected, and that there is some real possibility for collective action and collective change in what we're seeing and how various communities are being targeted, but also thinking about what are our collective responses, right? And how do we come together to collectively engage in resistance?
I love that the theme of hope is really standing out for me in looking at this book. This is not a book about victimhood. It is about the hurts and pains and the causes, but also about the possibility of the hope, about what's around the corner, about what people are doing, how people are resisting. And I think that's really powerful. And that's exactly what aha moments are, Lindsay. I thought aha moments were when we learn something new, but I learned that aha moments are when someone gives us language for something we've known all along. Right. And I love those aha moments. Well, we are running out of time. And as you both know, this podcast is called Student Affairs Now. And we always like to end with the question, what are you thinking, troubling, or pondering now? So it might be something from the book. It might be something from today's conversation, or something that's really just with you in this moment as we conclude this conversation. Susana, what are you with right now?
I'm excited for the conversations that will be produced as a result of the book, and so I'm excited to, to have leaders and administrators read it. But I'm pondering also that the violence still continues, and it's been taxing, and to hold all the things that have happened since at the end of the election, and so I'm holding all of the folks, in particular our Asian American siblings, in our field, holding them near and dear to my heart at the moment.
Lindsay?
Yeah, I think, echoing what Susana is talking about is just recognizing and acknowledging the pain that the Asian American community is experiencing right now. Something, we're hearing about things almost every day that are continuing to happen, and just really, recognizing that pain and that hurt that's being caused and perpetrated. Thinking about, what can we do, I think is another question that, I'm continuing, we're always thinking about, but really there's some urgency to that in terms of how do we address anti-Asian hate? How do we address anti-Latinx hate? How do we address anti-Blackness, which are all questions that institutions are grappling with right now? And thinking about, right, who needs to be at the table, right, in these discussions, and ensuring that in terms of everyday practice and what we do at our institutions, that there's an opportunity for all of the important stakeholders to be at the table to make these decisions about how we're going to disrupt what we see happening. And so that's something I've just been thinking about with some work that I'm doing right now at my institution, and just kind of being hopeful. I think being hopeful that in all that we do, even if no matter how small our sphere we feel our sphere of influences are, that there's change to be made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love you ending on hope, and not a naive hope, a hope that really recognizes the reality of what is going on, but says that we have some agency to make the world a better place tomorrow than it is today. So that's powerful. Thank you so much to both of you for being awesome guests today. And thanks for your wonderful book. It's a great contribution. I learned a lot reading it and in the conversation today. And thank you for centering perspectives that too often are overlooked. So thanks to both of you. To our listeners, you can receive reminders about this and other episodes by subscribing to our Student Affairs Now newsletter. You get that each Wednesday with the latest episode that we're sharing with you. You can also browse our archives at studentaffairsnow.com, which the marvelous Heather Shea has organized into the ACPA NASPA professional competencies. Thanks to our sponsors today, Leadership and Stylus Publishing. Please subscribe to the podcast, invite others to subscribe, and share on social, or leave a 5-star review. It really helps conversations like this reach more folks and build a community so we can continue to make this free for you. Again, I'm Keith Edwards. Thanks to our fabulous guests today and to everyone who's watching and listening. Make it a great week. Thank you all.
Thank you.